Samidani, you say?
Do wiesz, dalej jest.
But Samidani?
Oops.
I see you, Sophie. I hope soon.
Dear colleagues, if you don't mind, I would now like to come to item number 16, the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize and the UN Nuclear Ban Treaty. I would like to warmly welcome the speakers for this debate. We have with us today, sitting immediately next to me, Mr. Leo Hoffmann-Axthelm, the Brussels representative of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, laureate of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Then, second, Ambassador Alexander Kment, the permanent representative of Austria to the Political and Security Committee. And finally, Ms. Judith Kurumi, Chair of the Council Working Party on Non-Proliferation. All three of you, a warm welcome. Ms. Kurumi is replacing Mr. Jacek Bilica, the EAS Principal Advisor and Special Envoy for the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, who was originally planned to represent the External Action Service in this debate, but had to cancel his participation due to an unforeseen commitment. Dear colleagues, I believe that the issue of nuclear disarmament is more pressing today than ever. The recent nuclear tests by North Korea and the ensuing verbal confrontation between the North Korean leader and the American president have once again demonstrated a real risk of dangerous miscalculations and nuclear escalation. In general, the overall number of nuclear weapons has decreased dramatically since the end of the Cold War, but there are still around 15,000 nuclear warheads spread around the globe. The use of only a small number of them would, as we know, have devastating effects for our planet and put the survival of mankind at risk. Despite their potentially catastrophic humanitarian consequences, nuclear weapons were until recently the only weapons of mass destruction not subject to a categorical ban. The adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons on the 7th of July 2017 was therefore a major milestone in multilateral nuclear disarmament efforts. The treaty prohibits the development, testing, possession and use of nuclear weapons, and it has been welcomed by many colleagues here in the European Parliament. However, none of the nuclear states signed the treaty, and of the 28 EU member states, only 2, Austria and Ireland, are among the signatories. Our speakers in today's debate have been personally involved in the fight for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. We look very much forward to hearing their point of views. And without further ado, I first give the floor to Mr. Hoffmann-Axthelm, followed by Ambassador Kment and Mrs. Kurumi. The floor is yours. Bitte sehr.
Vielen Dank, Mr. McAllister. Distinguished members of the European Parliament, on behalf of the 468 partner organizations that ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, has in 101 countries, thank you very much for inviting us to address the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Parliament. As has been mentioned, in recent weeks and months, we have heard a lot more about nuclear weapons than we are accustomed to. The episode between President Trump and North Korea tells us two things, first and foremost. One, nuclear weapons are 1940s technology and are in principle available to any country, even an impoverished and isolated nation such as North Korea. And secondly, even mature democracies such as the United States can produce leaders who who are unpredictable and should not be trusted with nuclear weapons. President Trump and Kim Jong-un appear to believe that they can increase their status by threatening to kill millions of innocent civilians. This is why we need to stigmatize nuclear weapons for what they are. They are not symbols of power. They are something to be ashamed of. Even before the recent tensions, the truth is that the danger of nuclear weapons never disappeared. With the end of the Cold War, we simply forgot about them. So today we have 9 nuclear weapon states who are putting 184 nuclear-free states at risk and taking the rest of us hostage. The world isn't a peaceful place, however. We have regional instability in many corners of the world, and we have been lucky for 70 years that nothing has gone wrong. At the same time, luck tends to eventually run out. So even here in Europe, we see that the nuclear rhetoric is actually heating up, and we still have 15,000 nuclear weapons lying around across the globe. Each one of these 15,000 weapons is prone to accidents. They have to be moved around, cleaned, maintained, and they have to be kept ready to be used at a moment's notice, because that is required for the practice of deterrence. Of course, keeping them ready for use at a moment's notice also increases the risk of accidents. And just last week, there was a false alert in Hawaii, where citizens were told that a ballistic missile was incoming. Of course, even a false alarm can trigger a counterattack. So even if deterrence worked in 100% of cases, and it is pretty clear that it does not, even then the sheer number of accidents should be sufficient to completely discredit the concept of nuclear deterrence. In spite of these dangers, there's currently very little progress on nuclear disarmament. So the United Nations Conference on Disarmament, the main body tasked with these issues, has actually not been able to even agree on a program of work in 22 years. That's since 1996. So clearly, nuclear disarmament is not something that can be discussed just by the nuclear-armed states themselves. You simply do not leave it to the smokers to introduce a smoking ban. Every country on Earth would be impacted by the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of a nuclear weapon. And every country on Earth has a responsibility and the right to do everything in its power to advance the cause of nuclear disarmament. The time to act is now. That is why 122 countries have adopted a treaty in July 2017 to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. This treaty is open to all states, and European citizens have a legitimate expectation that European governments too will sign and ratify this treaty. Austria and Ireland have already signed the treaty, and Sweden, Cyprus and Malta have equally voted in favor of it. But many other European member states have stayed away. Until now, governments of countries such as Belgium and Germany have been able to claim in front of their citizens and in front of their parliamentarians that they are pursuing nuclear disarmament. Now, the ban treaty shows us that many of these countries who claim to be committed to nuclear disarmament cannot even bring themselves to declare these weapons illegal. Making this division visible is not in itself divisive. Making the division visible is actually the first and necessary step to enable us all, journalists, politicians, to address this divide and to overcome it. We have heard also in recent months, many times, that the nuclear weapons ban treaty would be incompatible with NATO. The United States actually sent instructions to all NATO states not to join the ban treaty. The paper was leaked in late 2016, and this paper is actually a good description of how the ban will delegitimize nuclear weapons. So on that, we actually agree. But we strongly disagree on the implication that the ban treaty would not be compatible with NATO. One should simply not use NATO as an argument to defend nuclear weapons and to postpone nuclear disarmament. The North Atlantic Treaty, which establishes NATO, is actually silent on the topic of nuclear weapons, whereas the strategic concept of NATO, a political document that is adapted from time to time, declares NATO a nuclear alliance for as long as nuclear weapons exist. But at the same time, it also commits NATO and its member states to creating, and I quote, to creating the conditions for a world free of nuclear weapons. Obviously, a treaty that bans nuclear weapons contributes to creating the conditions for a world without nuclear weapons. So states that want to sign this treaty will simply need to negotiate an opt-out from extended nuclear deterrence within NATO. Now, to claim that this requirement would constitute an existential threat to NATO, as some people have, ignores the very nature of the alliance. NATO as an alliance has always been a flexible organization that has been able to adapt and accommodate for the needs of its member states. For example, Spain, Norway, Denmark, Iceland and Lithuania have all long banned the transit of nuclear weapons on their territory and on their waters in peacetime, including for nuclear-capable ships. This is just one of many examples of how NATO can accommodate the allies concerned. France, for example, has long not participated in nuclear planning of the alliance. So the Cold War is obviously over, and we would say that there is no need to continue deploying American nuclear weapons in Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. Eliminating these weapons is not a technical problem. It just requires political will including the willingness to challenge the status quo. A willingness to change perceptions and delegitimize nuclear weapons at every level. We have previously, having 1,000 nuclear weapons, of course, would be a lot better than having 15,000 nuclear weapons. So I'd simply state that every step in the direction of changing perceptions about nuclear weapons and reducing the dangers is a welcome step. In closing, this nuclear ban treaty is not actually a revolution. It simply normalizes the way that we talk about nuclear weapons. We previously had a discourse that separated these weapons from normal weapons, that elevated nuclear weapons, made them symbols of power and status. But we need to look at these weapons not as an abstract concept, but rather as physical machines, as real weapons that exist in the real world with real consequences. Once you analyze nuclear weapons for what they are, it becomes clear very quickly that nuclear weapons are completely unacceptable. With entry into force of this new treaty, nuclear weapons will be banned under international law, like chemical and biological weapons have been banned before. Now we have to work for EU member states to join this treaty as well. If you agree with this proposition, I would encourage members of the European Parliament to sign the ICANN Parliamentary Pledge, which commits signatories to work for the ratification of their respective governments. It is our joint responsibility to make sure that this world becomes a safer place without nuclear weapons. As the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon back then said, there are no right hands for the wrong weapons. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, distinguished parliamentarians. It's a great honor for me to be invited to this meeting and to have the opportunity to participate in this exchange. On behalf of Austria, I will also congratulate ICANN for having been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize 2017. By way of introduction to this exchange, I would like to make a few short points on the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. First point, the threat associated with nuclear weapons and public awareness about it currently seems to be focused very much on Northeast Asia, maybe on Iran. But it is still Europe where more nuclear weapons are present than in any other region of the world, and this is a clear, concrete and significant risk to our populations. And this is one of the reasons why Austria, together with many countries, including several from Europe, decided to step up engagement on nuclear disarmament and to get involved in this treaty initiative. Second point, the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons comes out of the so-called humanitarian initiative, which looked at humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and found that they are catastrophic and much graver and much more complex than previously understood. Furthermore, any use of nuclear weapons would be a grave breach and contravention of international humanitarian law. And what's more, the risk of such a use, either by accident or by design, is also significant and is also greater than previously understood. And recent real-world developments have reminded us very starkly about this fact. On many occasions, we just simply have been lucky. Third point, nuclear weapons as the foundation of international security is thus an incredibly precarious concept. And in light of this, a reassessment of the concept of nuclear deterrence is needed. And the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons is an urgent call by the international community to do just this. And the overwhelming majority of states demonstrate that and they demonstrate that every day, that their preferred choice of achieving security without nuclear weapons is perfectly realistic. Fourth point, and it was already alluded to, multilateral nuclear disarmament efforts have stalled for a very long time, And this new treaty is the first concrete result in this field since the adoption of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1996, which, as we know, has not yet entered into force. So for anyone who's sincere about nuclear disarmament and making progress towards a world without nuclear weapons, this treaty should really be welcomed. Fifth point, during the negotiations, very much care was taken that the treaty is fully in line with existing international nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation architecture, specifically with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which is the cornerstone. So the new treaty, Prohibition Treaty, strengthens the NPT, in particular by contributing to and making concrete Article 6 of the NPT, which is the nuclear disarmament obligation. But on top of that, the treaty strengthens the taboo against nuclear weapons and is thus an extremely important non-proliferation measure as well, specifically in the current circumstances. Sixth point, the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons creates a signpost, a framework and a stimulus for concrete nuclear disarmament, but it cannot, and it also was not supposed to, substitute political will for nuclear disarmament, which currently is insufficient on the parts of states that possess nuclear weapons. But we believe that the Nobel Peace Prize, the fact that over 120 states support this treaty, sends a clear message, and specifically the strong arguments underlining this treaty, which states possessing nuclear weapons find increasingly difficult to ignore. Seventh point, the original objective of the humanitarian initiative that led to the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons was to create a new and different framework for a discussion on nuclear weapons. But until now, states possessing nuclear weapons have been reluctant or outright hostile towards engaging substantively on the humanitarian consequences and risks discussions because they were opposed to a possible ban treaty. But with the ban treaty now being there, expected to enter into force soon and becoming a reality in international law, there may now be a possibility to shift attention from a discussion merely on the pros and cons of a treaty and to actually have a meaningful discussion. And this meaningful discussion would be necessary on the arguments that underpin the treaty, which is the humanitarian consequences and the risks of nuclear weapons, and what this means for the validity of nuclear deterrence as a security concept and for the alleged security value of nuclear weapons as such, as was originally intended by the humanitarian initiative. And lastly, and that's a sort of broader point a political point for the European Union, it's also about credibility and effectiveness of the European Union as a global actor. Because for the EU, effective multilateralism is both. It's the preferred method of addressing global challenges, and it's also a key objective of achieving a global order that's based on international law. And the EU sees itself, and rightly so, as the champion of multilateralism, and we all know that multilateralism, global governance and the rule of law are today under a very serious threat. So the EU has the same ambition, high ambition, when it comes to strengthening the global nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation architecture, and is doing a lot to achieve this. But we have to realize, and we have to be honest, we need to recognize that the position of the European Union, specifically on nuclear disarmament, is considered as somewhat lacking credibility by large parts of the international community. This deficit predates the Prohibition Treaty, but it came very much to the fore in the process that led to the treaty. And this has a negative impact on our credibility and on our effectiveness, not only on disarmament and non-proliferation, but more broadly on our ambition as EU to be champion and a credible champion of effective multilateralism. So I would like to close by saying that a stronger focus as the European Union on nuclear disarmament, including engaging constructively on this new treaty, and even more importantly on the substantive arguments that underpin this treaty, which is the consequences, the risk, and what does it mean for security, that would be a very important step for the EU to change this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Muchas gracias, embajador. Ahora
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador. Now we're going to hear from Judith Karami. Thank you.
Distinguished members of the European Parliament, thank you for the invitation to this meeting to exchange views on the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize and the UN Nuclear Disarmament Treaty. I am honored to represent the EES in the absence of the Special Envoy on Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, Jacek Belica, who is in Paris participating in a conference for launch of international partnership against impunity of use of chemical weapons. Following the example of High Representative Vice President Federica Mogherini, let me also express my appreciations to Mr. Leo Hoffmann-Axthelm, who represents the Nobel Peace Laureate International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which was awarded this prestigious prize for its work to draw attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and for its groundbreaking efforts to achieve a treaty-based prohibition of such weapons. In the statement on this occasion, the High Representative said, and I quote, "The European Union shares the commitment to achieve a world free from nuclear arms, and we will continue our daily work for non-proliferation and disarmament with all our partners in the world. We are constantly engaged for the full implementation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and its review, and for the entry into force of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. We are working to seek a peaceful political pathway towards the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We will continue to make sure that the deal with Iran is fully implemented by all sides." I chaired a meeting of the Council Working Party on Non-Proliferation called CONOP, at which member states, experts exchanged their views on nuclear disarmament, among many other issues related to weapons of mass destruction and conventional weapons. I have the privilege of steering the discussion and sometimes the onerous task of finding a common ground among experts that can be translated into a common EU message on all nuclear-related topics. Let me underline at this point that disarmament, nuclear disarmament that is, not the only of the key pillars here. The other two being non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and cooperation in the field of peaceful uses. So it is fair to say that non-proliferation alone is spelled out in the name of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, that is the NPT. The language of the document does not establish any conditionality among these three areas. The NPT calls for simultaneous action on all its provisions. Likewise, EU member states consider these three pillars of the treaty equally important and mutually reinforcing. Thereby progress, though it may be uneven, in the implementation of the treaty provisions and of the particular tasks contained in the 2010 Action Plan will take us a step closer to the ultimate objective of the world without nuclear weapons. Therefore, their support has been unwavering and continuous. But let us not forget that the NPT is yet to be universally adhered to, and the resolution on the Middle East adopted by the 1995 Review and Extension Conference of the NPT is yet to be implemented. EU member states have also been united in interpreting the significance of the NPT for the global nuclear non-proliferation regime. Indeed, the NPT is the cornerstone of this edifice on which everything else depends. There may be many and often lively disputes about the way forward, but even the most sceptical critics of the treaty acknowledge that the NPT has made a crucial contribution to international peace, security and stability over the past half-century. Understandably, it has been long held priority for EU member states to uphold and preserve the NPT as a key multilateral instrument to promote its universalization and strengthen its implementation. I would like to bring these facts to your attention because the emergence of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has not changed them. the ban treaty, as it is commonly referred to, is an issue on which, admittedly, there is no agreed EU position. Moreover, it is not likely that this division of views among EU member states, or in fact within the international community, as to how best proceed with nuclear disarmament, can soon be overcome. The background of and the process leading to the ban treaty were described in greater detail by the Special Envoy during a discussion at SEDE on the 17th October last year. Today, I would only like to point out that in the vast array of nuclear issues under the NPT on which discussion is going on, this is only one of the important topics, and its leading position is being challenged by news from the Korean Peninsula. But let me also recall that in 2015, at the previous NPT review conference, it was the Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction on which delegates failed to agree, and the conference ended without adopting a final outcome document. Therefore, notwithstanding their differences over whether the ban treaty as adopted whether the ban treaty as adopted was a far-sighted move or not, and whether it would eventually bring us closer to our shared goal of living in a world free of nuclear weapons, the EU and its member states continue to contribute actively to global efforts to seek a safer world for all and to create the conditions for a world without nuclear weapons in accordance with the goals of the NPT, in a way that promotes international stability and based on the principle of undiminished security for all. The EU and its member states will spare no efforts to ensure that the success of the 2020 NPT Review Conference, the 10th cycle of which is considered important in many aspects. By the way, the first and the second sessions of the Preparatory Committee for this review conference are chaired by senior diplomats from EU member states, the Netherlands in 2017 and Poland in 2018, respectively. Last May, during the first session of the Preparatory Committee for the 2020 NPT Review Conference, the EU delivered 5 statements, one in the general debate, one in the 3 specific debates on disarmament, non-proliferation and peaceful uses, and a short one on the Middle East. 2 side events were also organised and 2 large working papers spelling out EU positions in detail on non-proliferation and peaceful uses were submitted. The preparations for the second session of the Preparatory Committee, which will take place in Geneva from the 23rd of April to the 4th of May, have already begun at CONOP. We are aiming for a very similar level of EU unity and visibility at this year's PrepCom. Member States have already identified the topics for 2 working papers and the themes for the side events. In the working papers, the EU will present its views on a fissile material cut-off treaty, which is considered as the next logical step in nuclear disarmament, and on nuclear disarmament verification, respectively. One of the side events will promote the ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, while the other will represent the benefits of the NPT in the area of peaceful uses. As I mentioned before, the division on the way forward on nuclear disarmament is not unique to the EU. This divide, deep as it may be, however, would not prevent EU member states from being proactive on all other issues of no lesser importance at the upcoming second session of the Preparatory Committee. The international community at large is looking for new bridge builders and pioneers of uncharted paths of creative diplomacy. I believe the EU and its member states could take a lead in that too. I thank you for your attention.
Muchas gracias, señora Coromí. Empezamos con...
Thank you very much. We'll open the discussion now. The first person to take the floor is Mrs. Gomez.
For coming to us and from your exposés. I think we have a long way ahead of us to indeed sensibilize member states. I remember I came into this parliament at the time when Mr. Solana was still in charge of our foreign policy, and there wouldn't be a single agreement that the EU entered without a clause on weapons of mass destruction. That is long gone. Anything goes today. And, of course, this is also very much reflected in, indeed, our lack of credibility, as you pointed out, in when we push for, be it a non-proliferation agenda or the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And yet it's so disheartening to see that, in a way, we are closer to dangers today than ever in terms of terrorist attacks against or accidents involving nuclear weapons or installations, and not to mention deliberate actions as they have been threatened. And you highlighted the recent scare in a way, and how that could have triggered indeed a reaction. And I hear that in the US not only people are being acquainted with a possible response in case of a nuclear attack, but that the Pentagon is considering using nuclear weapons against cyber attacks, which would be, in my opinion, totally irresponsible, totally disproportionate, and indeed would escalate it dangerously for the whole world. In the EU, I believe the problem is that we have two nuclear states, and they obviously have been busy creating the perception that all the money that they spend in those nuclear armaments is well spent and is protecting Europeans. It is not, as you have highlighted. It is not. It's actually, and I think the challenge for us is to indeed demonstrate that this really undermines our credibility in our action to get rid of nuclear weapons or of threats or non-proliferation, be it in North Korea or Iran or elsewhere. But that first they are diverting resources from real needs in terms of security and defense, and they are putting our citizens at risk. That is a case that we have to make to our citizens, and namely of these two countries. And my question to you is whether, with Brexit on the horizon, indeed there won't be as well an opportunity to actually make the case for the dangers. I wouldn't say the obsolescence, because it's not obsolete. The danger is very real. But the absolutely perverse dangers to which Europeans are being exposed. And I'd like to ask, why isn't this a priority as well? And I'm glad that you have explained that indeed this does not contradict NATO, at least in words, although we know that some of the members actually have a very dubious double face on this matter. But why isn't the European Union and the High Representative more vocal on this, namely confronting our nuclear member states with their concrete responsibilities? I would have said this is exactly what we need, a High Representative for External Action and for Security and Defence, and I would absolutely back Federica Mogherini were she to be more vocal and not just happy with business as usual. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mrs. Alusin.
Ich bin gerade verwundert, dass ich so schnell drankomme.
I must say I'm a bit surprised that it's my turn. Usually as a small group we're given the floor at the end. But anyway, let me thank all of you for the excellent work you've done. And even though a lot of work is still ahead of us, I do think that an important step has now been taken, and the agenda or the issue is now moved up a notch on the agenda, also thanks to you winning the Nobel Prize. Of course, in our discussions, we also need to dispel some falsehoods and make sure that we can convince the citizens and also those who take political decisions. One of these myths or falsehoods, for example, is having a nuclear war. Once it's clear, or you've made it clear, that no one can win a nuclear war, you automatically exclude this option of striking first. I mean, the protagonists involved in all of this might not act in a logical way, which of course makes it all the more dangerous, but there are no winners in a nuclear war. Now, recently I read that nuclear weapons which are less explosive are now being developed. Now, less explosive, what is that to mean? I mean, I hope our citizens know that that's still more powerful than any bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And I think people in the US don't fully appreciate that under Trump. The same goes for the NATO protection shield. If I were to ask my mum what's bad about that type of shield, she would say, well, there's nothing bad about it. It would stop us being bombed using nuclear bombs. Again, that's a falsehood, but my mother would believe it. A shield would not stop any nuclear bombs from coming in, but could be part of a preventive strike. So again, it increases the danger rather than allays it. Then the representative from the European Commission said that further steps need to be taken. What could those steps be then? I think it's important for us to agree on what those future steps are. I would suggest that one step would be to move away from this option of striking first. But we would also need to look at the modernization of nuclear weapons and agree against that. I think that's fairly topical at the moment. NATO has started modernizing a large part of its nuclear arsenal. At least they've announced that. Now, Mrs. Gomez said that her interpretation is that there is no conflict with NATO policy. Maybe I haven't fully understood what she said, because in my view there is a major clash with the current NATO policy. And I've understood what she said to mean that this should be compatible with NATO policy, but now, de facto, it runs counter to NATO policy. Because if new shields are being constructed, for example, or if any further steps on modernizing the arsenal are being considered. There's not a lot I can contribute in addition to what you've said. Could I just ask you what, in your view, would be the future steps that we could consider and what kind of possibilities there are? And please also point us in the direction of what we can do as MEPs to support your endeavours. And what kind of confidence-building measures can the EU put in place at political level? Of course, just this policy of pointing the finger at each other and using that as justification is not something which is going to be productive. We need to be able to build confidence, and I would ask you what, in your view, the necessary measures could be.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, I'd like to begin by congratulating ICANN, the Nobel Peace Laureate. And I don't always think that the Nobel Prize Committee reaches the right conclusion. But actually this time round I'm really, really pleased with the result. And I'm very happy that you were awarded the prize. I think you're very much deserving of it. As you mentioned, Sweden was one of the countries that voted in favour in terms of the vote, and I'm very happy about that. For me, it was something that we expected, but we also expected that Sweden would be first to ratify, of course. But when Sweden did vote in favour, it wasn't long before we got a visit from NATO. And they told us that if you ratify this agreement, then you will no longer be able to participate in the common defence exercises. And this became a big debate in Sweden because previously there has been strong public opinion against going into NATO. And one of the big problems with that kind of agreement, according to those who are against it, is that there is no guarantee that then NATO would not come with vessels and submarines that were nuclearized. But we were told that that wouldn't be the case and so on. However, we did vote in favour of the agreement, and we heard straight away that then, for example, the United States wouldn't provide any guarantees, that they would tell us if there were nuclearized weapons on vessels in Swedish waters. So that would make it very difficult for us to cooperate with the US and NATO. And that obviously has blown up this debate once again in Sweden. So, once again, as with many different dossiers, when we have to take a decision on something, it's got to be properly looked into first. So now we're looking at the possible ramifications and implications of the possible ratification of this agreement and then the subsequent enforcement of it. That is part of the normal decision-making process in Sweden. But these processes can sometimes go quickly or slowly. And in this case, things are moving quite slowly. But we do also need to have a majority backing for the decision to be taken in the Swedish Parliament. So we are faced with a dilemma here. But I would like to hear what you have to say about this. NATO is actually stepping in and interfering, actually. Once countries have adopted a position, countries that for many years have been working for non-proliferation and disarmament and have held that argument up as a kind of flagship initiative, a country like Sweden, which is now being threatened by NATO because we're actually doing and implementing what we've always said we wanted to do.
Señor Benifei.
Thank you, Mr. Benifei.
Sì, grazie Presidente.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to start off by congratulating Ican on the prize he has received, the Nobel Peace Prize. In 2015, we wanted to meet in Parliament together with Ilkan to have a discussion on the humanitarian aspects of the work that he was doing. And this in the context of the work done on the nuclear ban treaty. And I think it's important to also disseminate information about this to our citizens. We need to make sure that everyone is aware of the humanitarian risks of nuclear weapons, and unfortunately the population at large, even in EU countries, is not fully up to speed with this. So in our discussions, I think we need to make sure that we divulge information and explain matters to our citizens. In particular, given that because of climate change and force majeure events, there is now more than before a higher risk in having the presence of nuclear weapons on the territory of certain countries. And the presence is more of a risk in countries than the use of those weapons is, I would suggest. I don't think that there's any doubt about the fact that the ban treaty has thrown up a number of questions. If you look at the existing instruments and if you look at international security, we need to make sure that it is compatible. We are in favour of negotiating on this type of instrument, and I think Parliament should speak to this again now that the instrument is in place. And I don't think that this initiative is in contradiction with existing instruments, such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but is complementary to it.